Hello and welcome to the Stockout. I'm one of your hosts, Mike Baudendistel, joined by Grace Sharkey. Grace, it's good to have you back.
Yeah, excited to be back. Back like college football season. That's how I like to see it. So, got a nice state game coming up here this weekend. I'm sure the rest of you down in SEC territory are excited to have it back as well. So, happy to see your face, that's for sure.
Sounds good. So, what we're going to do today is we'll give a quick recap of the past three shows. Interviewed three different guests. Thought those were pretty interesting, and then we'll talk a little bit about the Nestle CEO change, which came as a surprise to most. That's really relevant for given our topic of CPG. They're the largest food and beverage company and have a big presence in the freight transportation world. And then we'll talk a little bit about the rail strike, which is something that short lived still has a big impact. And then if there's time, let's go into Kamala Harris's price gouging plan, et cetera. But I guess the way we'll start is if anyone's not already signed up for the Stockout newsletter, you can do that. Go to www.freightwaves.com/the Stockout, or just go to freightwaves.com, go to the site. Up at the top under newsletters, you can do the Stockout. It can be the first one there under supply chain. So I'd encourage you to sign up for that one, as well as a lot of the others that are in there. We put out a lot of good content every day, and was good to see that we've added someone who writes up the rail industry and maritime industry, Stuart Churls.
Yeah.
He's been putting out a lot of good stuff that's I've been reading. So go check all those things out as well. But I want to get into talking about the last three shows. So I'll do what I used to do in finance, which is sometimes give like a kind of a one-liner on what I thought about it. I used to do that about what I thought about a certain stock. I'll give a kind of a one-liner on what I thought about these shows and what the amazing takeaways are. So 3 weeks ago, I had John Schmitter on. John's co-founder of Rail State. Rail State's a company that collects data on trains. So basically they set up all these sensors and along the wayside of the trains, looks at the consist, how many rail cars are on there. They know that train that's in certain location one day is in a different location the next, gives them all this information about the fluidity of the network. So shippers use that to determine routing information, particularly those kind of the big bulk shippers have no other option other than to use rail. They can maybe use CN or CP in different routings. So he had John Schmitter on 3 weeks ago, and now I think their data is really even more relevant. Data is even more relevant the more disruptions there are. And so I encourage you to reach out to John Schmitter and Rail State to see just how the Canadian rail networks are recovering. It was sort of unprecedented that both rail networks were shut down at one time. Get into that a little bit later. So that was 3 weeks ago. That's up on the FreightWaves Stockout YouTube channel. And then 2 weeks ago, interviewed John McCown. John McCown is a maritime expert. He's former CEO of Trailer Bridge, among other things, and has worked for investment firms over the years. Really knows the maritime space closely. And I think the sort of short summary is that he's bullish on the ocean industry from the perspective of the carriers. Really, these alliances allow the carriers to manage capacity closely, blank sailings, and that Cape of Good Hope situation, avoiding the Red Sea, still having a very big impact. What's had kind of a more of an emerging impact was congestion at various ports around the world, particularly the port of Singapore, which is a big hub. And even though Maersk recently said that ocean rates they think have peaked, still at a very high level. We have that in Sonar under the Freightos Baltic Daily Index, and particularly from China to the U.S. East Coast. Those are still at very elevated levels. Those haven't come down much at all. So still a lot of tightness on the ocean. And then last week had on Thomas Wasson, who people at FreightWaves are familiar with. Thomas, he is showrunner for Loaded and Rolling. That's the show that focuses on the asset-heavy carriers, and he was also bullish from the perspective of the carriers he follows, the asset-heavy truckload carriers. Thinks that we does see evidence of the market turning. Thinks this sort of freight recession getting long in the tooth. We have been writing up more stories on FreightWaves.com about bankruptcies and capacity coming out of the industry. Those have been becoming more frequent, and he had lots of ideas how carriers or how shippers, such as those CPG and retail companies that might be targeted for the audience of the show, should position themselves in the current freight market. So, Grace, wanted to get your thoughts on this. I mean, you've dealt with how shippers manage their routing guides in the real world. So, what's your perspective on all this?
Yeah, I will say, well, first off, shout out to Thomas for taking over the radio for me as well for the last couple of weeks. And the episode last week, I think his thoughts on the current market were spot on, and predictions as well. I mean, like he said, and I think we'll go over here shortly. I think we have a chart for this as well. Outbound tender rejection rates are better than they were this time last year. Not insanely better, but definitely better. I mean, I think if we all take a second to look at that chart, we would hope to see 2019 levels, but we all know that's an anomaly that we're probably not going to see anytime soon. So I think with what we're seeing so far, we see seasonal bumps in certain modes, reefers as well. Again, he brought up last week what we're hearing from a lot of these earnings calls that we're, of course, covering here at FreightWaves. And for the longest, I think you agree, we heard pretty much a lot of these, especially the trucking side, executives afraid to put out really any predictions, just not sure where the market was heading. And now we're starting to sound a little bit, hear a little bit more confidence, I think, in where they see the market going as the year comes to an end. And also on top of that, just a really strong hold on rates as well, which I think backs up, again, the bankruptcies we're seeing, where capacity is going so far, and them kind of doubling down on that confidence and saying, listen, this is what we expect. And because of that, we're going to stick here with the rates that we're at too. And, it's interesting. I think, I want to say, maybe it might have been near the beginning of July, we started talking about the possibility of seeing shippers as well start to bring in more of the holiday goods earlier. And I think I was reading consumer reports before the show today, and I think we're seeing that even in consumer expectations as well. I mean, we're already expecting some reports of up to 4.8% year-over-year increase on holiday spending. And what's interesting too is, like, what a lot of consumers are saying is that they want to shop early and they want to shop for essentials, and not just, gifts that people don't need, you think they need, but things, around the house. I know I'm going to be that type of person. If you're going to get me something, either get me a gift card at a store that I use, or something that I need and kind of want to get in a back way, or some sort of way like that. So we're going to see, I think, a lot of more of those, maybe a little bit bulkier goods. So I would hope that transfers over to the trucking market as well. And again, I think the fact that we're just seeing consumers planning ahead, with a lot of them, especially parents, saying that they want to start shopping before October into September, and most looking to start looking at shopping near the beginning of October. We also mentioned the fact that this is going to be a really short Thanksgiving to Christmas season, only 27 days this year. So I think with all that said, I would expect that shippers are going to be planning their relationships with carriers and their overall plans and routing guides for the holiday season to match that expectation. I'm not 100% sure. I know we've brought up in the past, like, if with the bankruptcies, like, if we'll see a really tight capacity. I'm not 100% sold on that happening just yet, but the signs are kind of pointing that way as we continue to see bankruptcies as well. So yeah, if I were shippers trying to plan the holiday season, clearly I'm hoping doing it much earlier than now, but understand that at least the consumer is starting to think ahead at this point in time too.
Yeah, you bring up a good point about the shortened holiday season, only 27 days between Thanksgiving and Christmas. So you could have a capacity crunch on the highway, really also on the parcel guys too. I mean, they have such a crush of packages around that time of year. Usually UPS and FedEx, their peak day is the December 20th or 21st. But maybe at the same time, what some of this data shows is maybe some of that's going to be alleviated by people shopping early. It also seems like just Amazon Prime Day has disrupted what the typical seasonal patterns are, because that's such a big holiday, and all the other retailers want in on that. So they sometimes put their sales before Amazon Prime Day. So kind of an interesting situation there. And then it's also interesting that these marketing groups expect almost a 5% year over year increase in holiday spending, despite all the pressures on the consumer. You would
Yeah.
think it would be maybe flat to up a point or two for inflation. Does that surprise you at all?
I think it definitely does. Again, I felt this way last year though, with consumer spending, and of course, even worse, looking at what the utilization of credit cards and how many were of all income types were maxing that out. Again, I guess what makes me feel a little bit more comfortable with the numbers that I think a lot of people are expecting to buy things they probably need today, but waiting until the holiday season to either receive it as a gift or some type of discounted rate as well. I know that's something we talk about Prime Days. A lot of people like to do. So I think we'll see a little bit less of like these maybe extreme gifts that I don't want to say toys and things of that nature, but for at least for the adult side of things that would go in your kitchen or maybe a vacuum, a little more boring gifts, right, from Santa Claus. I think is the only reason I would back those numbers, right? Maybe people are saving now; they're holding off until they start to see these holiday deals come through, and then it's your parents are going to buy each other a new vacuum and a new carpet cleaner and call it a day.
Gotcha. So speaking of boring gifts, we'll move on to Nestle, which makes products that I don't particularly find exciting. I don't find food and beverages all that exciting. But Nestle is the world's largest food and beverage company. Their CEO departed. They have a new CEO, which was really a surprise, I think, to most people, even those who follow the industry closely, even those who are inside of Nestle. The words you hear are sort of abrupt, surprising, those type of words. So basically what happened is their CEO, Mark Schneider, he's been CEO for 8 years. The board gave him 24-hour notice. They were going to move on to Laurent Frixie. And basically, the consensus on Mark was that he did a good job. He was a good CEO. People liked him. He oversaw the company's transformation into acquiring a lot of companies that were in the higher growth areas. Those would be things like things that are related to health, health and fitness. Like things like Persona Vitamins was one of them. Things like pet food is a faster growing segment. So they got into a lot of these areas that were a little bit faster growing, a little bit higher margin, which is sort of what you have to do when you're already the biggest company if you want to grow the top line. And then they divested a lot of lines where they felt like they did not have a differentiated product. Some of that was the regional bottled water, some confectionery products they did. So that strategy really seemed to make a lot of sense, on the surface. I mean, maybe now that people of all incomes want to save money on CPG items, maybe you want to do a little bit more like what Smucker does, which kind of in its coffee line, you can, if you trade down, you're also trading down to something else that Smucker makes. But that's true also to a large extent for Nestle as well. Just they have so many brands. I mean, it's a certain number of hundreds of brands. People underestimate how large they are, and so. Mark is out. Laurent is in. He's been with Nestle for a very long time, a number of decades, 30 or 40 years. Has been with the company all over the world in various different positions. Or the phrase they keep using is that he knows Nestle, inside and out. They did an analyst call where they talked a lot about his credentials. Didn't talk so much about Mark, and we can sort of only speculate why now. I mean, they did allude to that the board decided, given the current market backdrop, without really going into a lot of detail. But I guess if you were to speculate, I think it's maybe the stock performance, and maybe he was a victim of just the stock falling a little bit out of favor, and really the sector falling a little bit out of favor. I don't know if we can get up this stock chart on the Nestle ADR. So there it is. So Nestle is the line in black, the Nestle ADR. That's how you would invest in Nestle, which is a Swiss company if you're in the U.S. on the U.S. exchange. And then on the left axis in blue is the S&P 500, and you see that how strong it performed relative to the S&P in 2019, 20, up into 22. I mean, that's back then, sort of 2 years ago, talking about how great Mark Schneider was, as one of the most respected CEOs in the space, or maybe in the broader business landscape, and it's underperformed and the last couple of years, and particularly since the middle of last year. And part of that, I just think, is the food companies are a little bit out of favor now that the higher risk companies are the ones soaring. Things like the tech stocks are soaring, and now the small caps have really taken off as well. So it may have been a little bit of a victim of the timing of those things. There were also some product issues that they talked about in the Wall Street Journal. I guess a couple children died from eating E. coli in France after eating pizza, and a couple other sort of maybe product quality incidents like that. But really, that's not what the company spent most of its time talking about. They were talking about how they're looking at more in terms of organic growth rather than acquisitions, and looking for maybe a few other ways to streamline the efficiency. But to a large extent, it sounded like there's nothing going to change dramatically. So it was a little bit of a puzzling one to me. I'm sure, Grace, you came in contact with Nestlé during your time in brokerages. It'd probably be hard not to. So what was unique about covering their loads, or maybe just, if you don't want to disclose any details about them in particular, it's sort of CPG, which I guess my understanding is if you're on the carrier side, the CPG can sometimes have its own challenges.
Yeah, I think CPG in general, we handled some like almost in like a co-broker. I won't say double broker, right? Because that sinful word we can't say here. But we co-brokered and helped with one of the larger companies that provided logistics for them. And I mean, with any CPG company, and that's funny listening to Thomas's chat. I think this from last week ties into a lot of this too. I mean, it's overall there's a lot more strict rules, and they're looking for dedicated carriers and strong networks to depend on, as most CPG companies do, right? There's the way that their operations work, their warehouses, the ability to time inventory appropriately means that they have to have carriers who are going to be on time, and of course treat the freight the way it needs to be treated, not trying to offload it, move it, stack it, anything like that, which means I would hope that, again, I haven't been close enough to say 100% on this one, but I would hope that, usually that comes with some pretty good rates as well. Thomas had brought up like the paper rates situation and ghost lanes in this past episode, which made me kind of think about this question as well. I mean, it's sometimes CPG companies, depending on the size of your brokerage and the type of freight you're moving and how big your carrier network can be, you might get awarded. There was a company that made plastic toy balls that I used to work with, and it was a company that maybe we would get 2 lanes out of a year. And I think the way that brokers are really watching their business, sometimes these CPG companies, you get that 1 lane. It takes a lot of resources depending on what you bid at and what rates you're at to often cover them. And then a lot of these companies really do have longer payment terms. So, it's not a company that, as a new brokerage or a brokerage, it's really struggling to have a livable margin. It's not the best freight for them. So CPG companies out there, Thomas brought this up, make sure you're looking into your partners, make sure you're looking into the brokers in your network and the carriers and where they're sitting even within their own financial situation. And just overall, let's say I am servicing a CPG company and I can do it. It's part of my wheelhouse. I look at like someone like Molo. I mean, Molo grew off accounts like this, right? This is like their bread and butter. What comes with it, though, is really good operations, not missing appointments, being sure that there's no delays. I mean, especially depending on where you are with Nestlé, if you're bringing product into their facilities, where you are in terms of like a vendor and supplier, oftentimes that can really mess up their overall supply chain habits as well. So the one thing too I wanted to bring up, just because I actually was talking to a friend about this weekend, bringing up the rail situation. A lot of these companies are looking and more interested, and we talked on the show, in different modes that they can move their shipments on. And I think rail is one of them in particular. I've been hearing that more and more frequently. So, if you are working with them, being able to have not just a strong truckload network, but having a team who's well voiced in intermodal and knows exactly how to quote that and build those relationships up as well, I think is a key to success in actually managing accounts like Nestle and CPG companies in particular.
Yeah, I think CPG is a really good candidate for intermodal because oftentimes, maybe most of the time, the CPG products are manufactured domestically in one centralized location and they're
Yeah.
distributed to stores throughout the country. Like you think about, General Mills has cereal making in Buffalo, New York. Well, you have the same cereal all over the country, so it does need to go a long way, oftentimes. And you mentioned that they send out the payment terms. Like, what's a typical payment term? Is it 60 days or 90 days, or how much are you talking?
I've seen them push 90 days. I mean, there's some big shippers that I've seen request 120 from the get-go. And a lot of times they'll say on their contracts 120 and then they'll pay in 60 or they'll pay in 45. But just knowing the economy and knowing the ability to push that back, you have to judge your business off of what that contract says. And I've seen that 120B on there before. So just something that you want to consider, especially in the market that we're seeing today, is maybe this, if you're a growing brokerage, is this the right company for us to or invest people in? Or is this maybe something we continue to build our network, continue to build our book, get better at it over time, and then start attacking some of these companies in particular?
Yeah, important consideration for all CFOs and controllers out there.
Yeah.
I'll move on to our last topic today, which is maybe the topic of the hour in freight transportation. Canadian rail workers are now have been ordered back to work. So now the cleanup begins. And so if you haven't been following this, this was something that Canadian National had been talking about on its most recent earnings calls. They've already had seen vessel diversions away from the Canadian ports into the U.S. ports. There were work stoppage concerns both on the railroad and among the port workers. And so they did, in fact, start the lockout on Thursday of last week at 12:01 a.m. Eastern, and it lasted until that evening when the labor minister ordered the rail workers back to work. So it lasted not quite 24 hours, call it 18 hours or so. And it's something that even when you have a worker shut down for a short period of time, it can take weeks for the rail network to really get up and running at full speed. There's all sorts of congestion. The rail networks run 24/7, 365, unlike a lot of businesses. So we have a sonar chart that shows rail volume is down. So this is on a 7-day moving average. So this could drop a couple more days to almost zero, and then it'll shoot back up. But this some of the data like that and sonar can help monitor where those corridors are recovering. Some of the other ones that are relevant here I talked about on one of the articles I wrote last week, which is the cross border was volume that was shut down. Also some of the volume from the East Coast U.S. ports to Canada, like there's significant intermodal volume from port of New York, New Jersey into Toronto. That's something that had been embargoed. So it's something that it's pretty disruptive. And then, Union Pacific took advantage of this, where they implemented surcharges of $300 to $500 per shipment on Union Pacific. That's for intermodal coming outbound from LA. So that's something that, even if you don't move anything in Canada, this can still be, very, very relevant to you. Even if you're just moving through the U.S. West Coast ports, there's that risk of having to pay higher fees, having to pay, have higher congestion, and it's something that takes a long time to clean up, even if things are very sort of short-lived. And it's kind of funny that the Canadian Industrial Relations Board deemed those workers non-essential, which allowed them to still have the potential to strike. And then the labor minister orders them back to work, and then they tried to strike. And then that same board that said they were not essential says, actually, now at this point, we defer to the labor minister. So it seems like that's a contradiction to me, but I guess they do things differently in Canada. Grace, in your experience, did you ever come across labor issues like this?
Not labor issues. I mean, the biggest issue that we had was the ELD mandate, which, depending on what your carrier network looked like, could have felt like a labor issue at the time. But you know, it is crazy. I think you put in our notes the noise article where he mentioned one train load requires roughly 300 trucks. That is crazy to think about. So I'm interested to see, what's on our shows and what some of these data insights show over the next week as we start to see them come back online. But it's probably for all the truck drivers out there working some of these lanes in particular, it's probably a nice little Labor Day blessing for them too. And unfortunately out of time, but we'll be back next week, and hopefully we'll have some data kind of discuss that as well next week too, so we can dive into that. But until then, make sure you head to freightwaves.com, click on newsletters, join the Stockout in our community, so you not only get that newsletter but this podcast every week too. And until then, enjoy your week.